Called cameras to watch his paralyzed mother, and what he saw a few days later made him realize he'd made a terrible mistake. The new caregiver wasn't following protocol. She was talking to his mother, whispering things he couldn't quite hear through the audio feed, and his mother's eyes were moving, tracking her across the room in ways the doctors said were impossible. Something was happening in that house, and he was 20 miles away watching it unfold in real time with no way to stop it. His mother had been silent for a year, completely paralyzed after a stroke that the doctors said destroyed her ability to move, to speak, to do anything except breathe and blink. But this African woman kept acting like his mother could understand every word, kept holding her hand and singing to her, and doing things that made his mother's vital signs spike on the monitors he obsessively checked. And then one night, while reviewing footage, he saw it. His mother's lips moved, just slightly, barely visible on the grainy feed, but they moved. And the caregiver leaned in close like she was listening to something, and whatever his mother said made the woman's face go completely still. He rewound the footage 17 times, trying to read his mother's lips, and he couldn't make out the words, but he knew it was about the argument they'd had 3 days before her stroke, the things he'd said, the reason she'd been crying, the truth he'd spent a year burying under expensive medical care and surveillance equipment. Now, this stranger knew his secret, and his mother was waking up, and the cameras that were supposed to protect him were capturing his own destruction frame by frame. What happens when the person you're watching starts watching back? If you're listening right now, here's to remind you that we care about you and your support is much appreciated. Remember how we agreed to help me prove my mother wrong? She said nobody cares about stories where love and survival thrives through difficult situations. If any part of this made you think about the times you had to love or pay sacrifices that cost you, then subscribe. We're building a community that cares about you. Comment where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs to remember that broken don't mean destroyed. Back to our story. Mi's son had been a hairdresser for 30 years before the house, before the gates, before the silence. She'd owned a small shop in Hongdae where university students came for cheap cuts and ajumas came for perms and gossip, and she'd known everyone's name, everyone's business, everyone's secrets. She'd raised Daejung in the apartment above that shop, just the two of them after his father died in a construction accident when the boy was 7. She'd worked doubles, she stretched every one. She made sure he had tutors when other single mothers were making their kids study alone. And he'd been smart, brilliant even, top of his class, full scholarship to Yonsei University. But somewhere between the scholarship and the expensive suit he wore to her shop one day to tell her he was done with school and moving into business, something had shifted in him, something she didn't recognize and didn't want to name. The house came with staff at first, a housekeeper, a cook, a driver, but Daejung replaced them every few months, always with some excuse about security concerns or trust issues. And eventually, Mi-sun stopped trying to remember their names because what was the point? She spent most of her time in the sunroom, the only place that didn't feel like a museum, surrounded by the plants she'd brought from her old apartment. Succulents and ferns, and a stubborn jade tree that refused to thrive no matter how much she watered it. She tried to leave once, just once, about 4 years ago, when the loneliness had gotten so heavy she could barely breathe, and she'd called her younger sister in Busan and said, "I think I made a mistake." Daejung had found out, she still didn't know how, and he showed up that same night with flowers and that smile and a soft voice that somehow made her feel like she was the one being unreasonable. "Amma," he'd said, holding her hands, "I bought this place for you, so you'd be safe, so I wouldn't have to worry. You're all I have." And she'd stayed. Because that's what mothers do, isn't it? They stay in places that hurt them if it means their children can sleep at night, even if those children never actually visit, even if the silence is so loud it swallows you whole. The fall happened on a Tuesday. Mi-sun would remember that detail later, in the strange way trauma makes you hold on to irrelevant things: the day of the week, the smell of the jasmine tea she'd been drinking, the fact that she was wearing her blue slippers, the soft ones Dae-jung had sent her last Christmas still in their box with a note that said, "Merry Christmas, Amma," in handwriting that wasn't his. She'd been reaching for the jade plant, the one that wouldn't grow, trying to move it closer to the window, because maybe, she'd thought, maybe it just needs more light. Maybe everything just needs more light. And then the floor wasn't there anymore. Or maybe it was there and her legs just forgot how to find it. The doctors at Samsung Medical Center used words like stroke and cerebral hemorrhage and extensive damage to the motor cortex, and they said these words to Dae-jung, not to her, even though she was right there in the bed, even though her eyes were open, even though she could hear every single syllable. But she couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything except lie there while her son stood at the foot of her hospital bed with his phone in his hand, not looking at her, already making arrangements with someone about long-term care options and private nursing and whatever it takes, I don't care what it costs. Guilt sounds expensive when you say it out loud, doesn't it? They brought her back to the house 6 weeks later, to a bedroom on the first floor that used to be a guest room she'd never seen anyone use, and they'd installed bars on the bed and a mechanical lift and a chair that looked like something from a dentist's office, and everything smelled like antiseptic and resignation. The first nurse was a Korean woman in her 50s named Mrs. Kang, who smiled too much and talked too loud and treated Mi-sun like a child who couldn't understand simple instructions. "Time for your bath, Halmani," she'd say, even though Mi-sun was only 63 and hated being called grandmother by strangers. Mrs. Kang lasted 2 months before Dae-jung replaced her with Mr. Cho, a male nurse who barely spoke at all and spent most of his shifts watching baseball on his phone with the volume low, keeping Mi-sun clean and fed with the mechanical efficiency of someone servicing a car. Mr. Cho lasted 4 months. Then came Mrs. Park, who smelled like cigarettes and complained under her breath in a dialect Mi-sun could barely understand. 3 months. Then Mr. Han, Mrs. Song, Miss Kim. Mi-sun stopped trying to communicate with them after a while. What was the point? They weren't there for her. They were there for Dae-jung's conscience, for the receipt he could point to if anyone ever asked whether he was taking care of his mother. And he never visited. Not once, in the first 8 months. He called Mrs. Sung every week to ask about her condition and any changes, and whether she was comfortable, but never asked to speak to Mi-sun herself, never seemed to consider that maybe she could hear him, maybe she'd want to hear his voice, maybe. Have you ever been forgotten by someone who's supposed to love you? Not abandoned, just forgotten, like you're still alive but already gone. The cameras appeared sometime around month 9. Mi-sun didn't see them installed. She'd been sleeping, or maybe just pretending to sleep, because that's what she did most days now, retreating into the only privacy left available to her. But when she woke, there was a small black dome on the ceiling above her bed, and another in the corner by the window, and a third near the door. Mrs. Sung noticed her looking at them. "Your son," she said, not unkindly. "He wants to make sure you're being taken care of properly." But that wasn't it, was it? He wanted to watch without being present. He wanted proof of care without the inconvenience of caring. He wanted to check a box that said, "Good son," without ever having to sit in this room and smell the antiseptic and look at what he'd let her become. Because here's what they don't tell you about strokes, about paralysis, about suddenly losing everything that made you, you. People stop seeing you as human. They see a body, a problem, a task to complete. They forget you're still in there, still thinking, still feeling, still aware of every single moment of every single day. Mi-sun could hear everything. The nurses talking about their boyfriends, their money problems, their parents. She could hear the TV in the other room playing the same news stories on repeat. She could hear her son's voice on speakerphone asking Mrs. Sung whether her mother had eaten, whether she had a bowel movement, whether the physical therapist had come, but never asking, "Can I speak to her?" Never saying, "Tell her I love her." The loneliness before the stroke was heavy. This was something else entirely. This was being buried alive in a body that wouldn't obey you, in a room full of people who talked around you like you were furniture, in a house your son bought to prove something to himself, and now used as a prison with medical equipment. And then Grace arrived. That wasn't her real name. Mi-sun would learn that later, but it's what the agency called her, what Mrs. Sung said when she left and the new caregiver walked in carrying a small canvas bag and wearing a yellow head wrap that was the brightest thing Mi-sun had seen in months. She was young, late 20s, maybe early 30s, dark skin, high cheekbones, eyes that actually looked at Mi-sun, not through her. "Hello," she said. And her accent was thick, unpracticed, but her smile was real. "My name is Grace. I am here to take care of you." And then she did something no one else had done in 9 months. She pulled a chair up next to the bed, sat down, and took Mi-sun's hand. Not to check her pulse, not to adjust her position, just to hold it. "You are Mi-san, yes?" Grace said. "That is a beautiful name. In my country, we have a name like this. Mi-san. It means beautiful and good, I think." Mi-san's eyes filled with tears. Grace saw them. "Oh," she said softly. "You understand me. I thought so. I thought, when I look at you, I see you are there, inside. You are still there." And for the first time since the fall, since the hospital, since the cameras and the parade of strangers and the suffocating silence of being forgotten, someone saw her. But upstairs in his office 20 kilometers away, De Zhang was watching the camera feed on his laptop and he was frowning. Because this new caregiver wasn't like the others. She was talking too much, getting too close, treating his mother like a person. And for reasons he didn't want to examine, that made him deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Grace sang while she worked. Not loudly, just under her breath, in a language Mi-sun didn't recognize but somehow understood, in the way you understand rain or wind, or any sound that comes from something genuine. The melodies were slow and winding, the kind of songs that felt old, older than Grace herself, passed down through generations of women who'd sung while they cooked or cleaned or rocked babies to sleep. Mi-sun had been in the house for almost a year now, and no one had ever sung to her. The cameras caught everything, of course. They always did. De Zhang started watching the footage more frequently, though he told himself it was just due diligence, just making sure this new caregiver wasn't stealing or mistreating his mother or cutting corners the way Mr. Cho had, eating his lunch during feeding time and rushing through the afternoon routine so he could leave early. But Grace never rushed. She would spend 20 minutes combing Mi-sun's hair, section by section, talking the entire time about her day or the weather or a memory from her childhood in Nigeria. She'd described the market near her village, the way her grandmother used to braid her hair so tight it gave her headaches, the specific taste of her mother's jollof rice. "You have good hair," Mi-sun said one afternoon, her fingers gentle against Mi-sun's scalp. "Strong. My mother, she always say you can tell a woman's spirit by her hair. Yours is fighting, even now. You are a fighter, Mi-sun." And Mi-sun, who couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except lie there and feel, felt something crack open inside her chest. When was the last time someone touched you like you were precious? Not fragile, precious. Dae-jung watched this interaction on his laptop at 11 p.m., loosening his tie in his downtown office while his associates waited in the next room. The deal they were negotiating involved container ships and customs officials and the kind of money that required men with guns standing outside the door. But he'd told them to wait. He needed 5 minutes. And now he was sitting there watching a stranger comb his mother's hair and feeling something ugly twist in his stomach. She was taking too long, being too familiar. He made a note to call the agency in the morning. But he didn't. Because the next day, he watched Grace help his mother with physical therapy, the exercises the actual therapist had prescribed, but that none of the previous caregivers had bothered doing properly. And his mother's right hand moved. Just a twitch, barely noticeable. But Grace noticed. "Mi-san!" she gasped, and the joy in her voice was so pure it made Dae-jung's throat tight. "You moved! Did you feel it? You moved your hand!" She grabbed Mi-san's hand and squeezed it. "Do it again! Try again! I know you can! I know you are in there fighting!" And Mi-san tried. God, she tried so hard Dae-jung could see the strain in her face, even through the grainy camera feed, and her finger, just her index finger, curled slightly against Grace's palm. Grace started crying. "You are still here. I knew it. I knew you were still here." Dae-jung slammed his laptop shut so hard, his secretary jumped in the outer office. That night, he had 3 drinks instead of his usual 1, and he watched the footage again and again and again until the loop of his mother's finger moving became something he couldn't unsee, something that proved she was conscious, aware, trapped, and he'd left her there. For a year, he'd left her there with strangers, checking in through cameras like she was a security feed, calling once a week to ask about medications and bowel movements, but never, not once, asking to speak to her because what would he even say? "I'm sorry, didn't cover it." Nothing covered it. The cameras were supposed to make him feel better, like he was still involved, still caring from a distance, the way rich people convince themselves writing checks is the same as showing up. But instead, they were showing him everything he'd been trying to not see, that his mother was still in there, still suffering, still waiting for a son who couldn't face what he'd become. Grace started arriving earlier and staying later. The agency had assigned her 8-hour shifts, but she'd come at 7 instead of 9 and wouldn't leave until 6 or 7 in the evening. And when Dae-jung called the agency to ask why his mother's caregiver was billing overtime, they said she wasn't billing anything extra. She was just staying. "Some of our caregivers, they connect with their clients," the manager explained, "especially the ones from traditional cultures. They see it as more than a job." "Is there a problem?" Dae-jung said no, but there was. Because Grace had started bringing things from home, a small portable speaker that played music Mi-san could actually hear, not the tinny garbage from phone speakers, a blanket from her own bed because she said the hospital blankets were too cold, too sad, photographs of her own family that she'd prop up on the nightstand and describe in detail. "This is my mother," she'd say, pointing. "You would like her. She is stubborn like you. I can tell you are stubborn because your son, he buy you this big house, and you do not look happy about it. Yes? You did not want to leave your old home." Mi-sun's eyes had filled with tears, and Grace had wiped them away with her thumb. "I understand," she'd whispered. "My mother also did not want to leave our village. But my father, he say we must go to the city for better life." "Better life," she'd laughed bitterly. "Better life means she die alone in a place where nobody speak her language. I was here, in Korea, sending money. I was not there." She'd leaned close to Mi-sun's ear. "I will not let that happen to you. You understand? You will not be alone." Dae-jung watched this with his fists clenched so tight his knuckles went white. This woman, this stranger who'd been here for barely 2 months, was giving his mother something he couldn't. Presence, attention, the kind of care that couldn't be bought or delegated or watched through a camera feed. And worse than that, his mother was responding. Her movements were small but increasing. A finger one day, a slight turn of her head the next, her eyes tracking Grace around the room instead of staring blankly at the ceiling. The doctors had said recovery was impossible. They'd said the damage was too extensive, the window for improvement had closed, and she'd be like this for whatever time she had left. But Grace either didn't know that or didn't care. She talked to Mi-sun like she could hear every word, because she could. She played music and described the world outside and brought in flowers and opened the windows to let in air that didn't smell like hospital and sickness. And slowly, week by week, Mi-sun was coming back, which meant eventually she'd be able to communicate. Eventually, she'd be able to tell someone what had happened the day before her stroke, the argument they'd had, the things Dae-jung had said, the reason she'd been crying when she fell. He started calling the house more often, asking Grace pointed questions about his mother's mental state and whether she seemed agitated or confused. He suggested maybe they should increase her sedatives, help her rest more, because stress isn't good for recovery. Grace had politely but firmly refused. She does not need to sleep more, she'd said, her accent thick but her meaning crystal clear. She needs to wake up. She has been sleeping too long already. And Dae-jung realized with creeping horror that he'd lost control of the situation. The cameras showed him everything, but they couldn't stop anything. He'd hired Grace to care for his mother so he wouldn't have to, but now she was caring too much, seeing too much, bringing his mother back from a place he needed her to stay. Have you ever wanted something and feared it at the exact same time? Wanted your mother to get better, but terrified of what she'd say when she could finally speak? That's where Dae-jung was now, trapped between guilt and self-preservation, and the cameras kept recording. 3 months after Grace arrived, Mi-sun said her first word. It happened on a Thursday afternoon while Grace was reading to her from a Korean cookbook, not because Mi-sun could cook anymore, but because Grace had noticed the way her eyes lingered on the food photography, the way something like hunger or memory would flicker across her face when Grace described certain dishes. Kimchi jjigae, Grace was saying, her pronunciation terrible but earnest. This one, it says you need gochugaru, the red pepper powder. My friend at church, she make this for me once. So spicy, I cry, but so good, I cannot stop eating. And Mi-sun's lips moved. Just slightly, just enough for a sound to escape. Soft and cracked and barely audible, but undeniably there. Good. Grace dropped the book. Mi-sun? She grabbed the old woman's hand, her eyes wide. Did you? Say that again. Please, say it again. Mi-sun's throat worked. Her eyes were wet, her whole face strained with effort, and Grace could see it cost her everything just to push out that single syllable one more time. Good. Grace started laughing and crying at the same time, squeezing Mi-sun's hand so tight it probably hurt. And she didn't care because Mi-sun was speaking. She was coming back. She was still fighting. Upstairs in his car, parked 3 blocks from a meeting he was already late for, Dae-jung watched the live feed on his phone and felt his entire world tilt sideways. His mother could speak. Not well, not clearly, but she could speak, which meant eventually she'd be able to say more than one word. Eventually, she'd be able to form sentences. Eventually, she'd be able to tell Grace about the argument. About what Dae-jung had said to her the week before her stroke, standing in her sunroom while she watered her dying plants, when he'd come to the house for the first time in months because he needed her to sign papers, legal documents that would transfer her old property in Itaewon into his name for business purposes. She'd refused. That shop was your father's, she'd said quietly, still not looking at him. I'm not selling it. I don't care what you need it for. And he'd lost his temper. Not the cold, controlled anger he used in business, but the old anger. The kind that came from years of feeling like he'd sacrificed everything to give her a better life, and she still looked at him with disappointment. "You don't care what I need?" he'd said. "You've never cared what I need. You think I wanted this life? You think I wanted to become this person? I did this for you. Everything I did was for you." "I never asked for this," she'd whispered. "You didn't have to ask. You just had to stand there looking sad in that pathetic apartment, working yourself to death, making me feel guilty every single day for not being enough, not making enough, not being the son Dad would have been proud of. Your father would have been ashamed of what you've become. I am ashamed. This house, this money, all of it. It's blood money, Daejung. You think I don't know? You think I don't hear the news? I know what you do. I know what you are." He left without another word, and 3 days later, she'd had the stroke. The doctor said it was coincidence, that strokes happen, that there was no way to predict or prevent it, but Daejung knew better. He'd seen her face when he left. He'd seen the way she'd crumpled into her chair, shaking. Stress, the doctors had said, can be a contributing factor. So he bought the cameras, hired the caregivers, paid for everything, because money was the only language he spoke fluently anymore. And he'd stayed away, because facing her, even unconscious, even silent, meant facing what he'd done. But now she was waking up, and Grace was the one waking her. Do you believe in divine punishment? In the universe's way of making sure you can't outrun what you've done? Daejung started visiting the house. Not inside. He couldn't bring himself to go inside. But he'd park across the street in the evenings and watch through the windows. Not the cameras, the actual windows. And he'd see Grace moving through the rooms, humming, carrying trays, adjusting pillows, taking care of his mother with a tenderness that made his chest physically ache. He hired a private investigator to look into Grace's background. The report came back clean. Too clean. Grace Okonkwo, 29, from Lagos, Nigeria, work visa sponsored by the caregiving agency, no criminal record, no debt, no red flags, but also no real history before she had arrived in Korea 3 years ago. The investigator noted this was common with migrant workers, that documentation from certain countries was often incomplete, that it probably meant nothing, but Daejung couldn't shake the feeling that Grace was hiding something. Or maybe he just needed her to be hiding something, because if she was exactly what she appeared to be, a good person doing a difficult job with genuine compassion, then that made him the villain in her own mother's story. He started calling the house at odd hours, asking to speak with Grace, asking questions that had no good answers. "Does my mother seem angry?" he asked one night. Grace paused. "She is frustrated, yes. She want to speak, but cannot yet. She want to move, but her body does not listen. Of course she is upset. Wouldn't you be?" "Does she ask about me?" Another pause, longer this time. "No," she said softly. "She does not ask." And somehow that was worse than if she had. Misun's vocabulary expanded slowly. One word became 2, then 3. Her pronunciation was slurred, her voice weak, but she could communicate basic needs. Water, pain, tired, cold. Grace celebrated every word like it was a miracle. Daejung monitored every word like it was a countdown to his own destruction. And then, one evening, while Grace was helping Misun with dinner, spooning soup into her mouth and wiping her chin with the kind of patience that comes from genuine love, Misun spoke 4 words that changed everything. "He was here before." Grace stopped, spoon halfway to Misun's mouth. "Who was here?" Misun's eyes moved to the camera in the corner, then back to Grace. "Daejung. Before this." Grace set the bowl down. She took Misun's hand. "Your son came to visit? Before you got sick?" Misun's face contorted with effort, with emotion, with something that looked like grief and rage tangled together. We fought. Two words that contained entire universes of pain. Grace didn't push. She just held Misun's hand and waited, because she understood that some truths take time to speak, especially when they've been locked inside your body for over a year. He said. Misun's breath came faster, her chest rising and falling with the effort of remembering, of forcing the words through a throat that barely worked. Said, I disappointed him. A tear rolled down her cheek. Said his father would be ashamed of me. Grace's face went very still. He said this to you? Her voice was quiet, dangerous. Your son said you disappointed him? Misun nodded, the movement tiny but unmistakable. And I said. She had to stop, had to breathe, had to gather strength from somewhere deep. I said his father would be ashamed of him. She started crying then, real sobs that shook her paralyzed body, and Grace gathered her up as best she could, careful of the fragile bones and frozen limbs, and held her while she cried for the first time since the stroke, maybe for the first time in years. Shh, Grace whispered, rocking her slowly. Shh, Misun, you are not wrong. You are not wrong to say this. A mother's job is to tell the truth, even when it hurts. And upstairs in his office, 20 kilometers away, Dae-jung watched this scene unfold on his laptop and felt something inside him finally break. Because he'd been wrong. The cameras weren't showing him that his mother was being cared for. They were showing him everything he'd destroyed, every moment of connection he'd missed, every word of comfort he failed to speak, every single day he'd chosen guilt and distance and money over simply being present. Grace had done in 3 months what he hadn't done in 30 years. She'd seen his mother as a person worth knowing, and now her mother had spoken the truth out loud. His father would be ashamed. His mother was ashamed, and no amount of cameras or monitoring or expensive care could change the fact that he'd earned that shame honestly. There is no relief in knowing you're the villain, no comfort in understanding exactly how you failed, just the slow, crushing weight of consequences you can't undo. Grace stopped answering Dae-jung's calls after that night. Not out of spite, Grace didn't seem capable of spite, but with a quiet firmness that somehow felt worse than anger. When he'd call the house phone, she'd pick up, listen to his questions about medications or therapy schedules, answer in brief professional sentences, and then say, "Misun is resting now, I must go," before hanging up without waiting for his response. The cameras still showed him everything, but now watching felt less like oversight and more like penance. He saw Grace teaching Misun to hold a spoon again, the older woman's hand shaking violently as she tried to grip the handle, soup sloshing everywhere, and Grace never once showing frustration, just patience and encouragement and small celebrations when Misun managed to get even one bite to her own mouth. He saw Grace brushing Misun's hair every morning and every night, braiding it sometimes in styles that reminded him of photographs from his childhood. His mother, young and beautiful, standing outside her hair salon with pride in her eyes. He saw Grace reading to Misun from Korean newspapers, stumbling over words she couldn't pronounce, and Misun's lips moving along with certain passages, her eyes sharp and present in a way they hadn't been with any of the other caregivers. He saw his mother becoming a person again, and he saw that she was becoming that person for Grace, not for him. The board meeting where everything fell apart was on a Tuesday in late autumn. Dae-jung was in the middle of negotiations with a shipping partner from Busan, the kind of meeting where everyone in the room had guns they pretended weren't there and smiles that meant absolutely nothing. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the special vibration pattern he'd set for the camera alerts, the ones that only triggered if there was unusual movement in his mother's room. He ignored it the first time. The second time, he excused himself to the bathroom and checked the feed. Grace wasn't alone with his mother. There was another woman in the room, older, Korean, wearing the kind of practical clothes ajumas wear to the market. She was sitting beside Mi-sun's bed, holding her hand, and even through the grainy camera feed, Dae-jung could see his mother was crying. He turned up the volume on his phone. "I told her she shouldn't come," Grace was saying softly, "that maybe you are not ready, but she insists. She says she has been calling the house for months and months, and nobody tell her where you are." The other woman leaned closer to Mi-sun. "Ianni," she said, older sister, and Dae-jung recognized her then, his mother's younger sister. His aunt from Busan, the one Mi-sun had called when she'd tried to leave the house years ago, the one Dae-jung had told the staff never to let through the gates. "I thought you had abandoned me," his aunt was saying, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you had become like him, too proud for family. But Grace, she called me. She tell me you have been sick. She tell me you have been here alone." Mi-sun's mouth was moving, words coming slow and slurred but determined. "He would not let you in." His aunt's face went hard. "He kept me from you?" "He kept everyone." Grace was crying now too, standing near the window with her arms crossed, and Dae-jung realized with dawning horror that she'd done this deliberately. She'd tracked down his aunt somehow, probably through old mail or photographs or one of the 1,000 small traces of a person's life that he'd never thought to hide, and she'd invited her here without his permission, without even telling him. She'd gone around him entirely. Do you know what it feels like when you realize you've lost control of your own story, when the narrative you've been telling yourself starts unraveling and you can't stop it? Dae-jung left the meeting without explanation. His associates called after him, angry and confused, but he was already in his car, already speeding toward Gangnam, with his hands shaking on the wheel and his chest so tight he thought he might be having a heart attack. He'd built walls to protect himself, emotional walls, physical walls, cameras to maintain distance while pretending to care. And Grace, she simply walked around all of it, seeing through to the truth he'd spent years trying to bury. His mother hadn't been protected in that house. She was imprisoned, and he'd been the jailer. When he arrived, the gates required his code, but his hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries. He parked crooked in the driveway and walked toward the house he'd bought but never really entered, not in any way that mattered. The front door was unlocked. He could hear voices from the first-floor bedroom, Grace's accent, his aunt's familiar tone, and underneath it all, his mother's halting speech, stronger now than he'd heard through the cameras. He stood in the hallway, frozen. Part of him wanted to storm in there and demand to know who gave Grace permission to invite people into his house, to make decisions about his mother's care without consulting him, to treat him like he was irrelevant in his own mother's life. But the larger part, the part he'd been running from for over a year, knew that he was irrelevant. He'd made himself irrelevant by choosing absence over difficulty, surveillance over presence, money over time. When was the last time you stood outside a door you were afraid to open, knowing that whatever was on the other side would change you and you couldn't go back? Grace found him there. She stepped into the hallway and stopped, not surprised exactly, but wary, like she'd been expecting this confrontation and had already decided how it would go. "Mr. Kang," she said quietly. It was the first time she'd called him by his name. Usually it was just her son or Daejung-si in that formal distance Korean demanded. You invited my aunt here without asking me. Yes, you had no right. You had every right. Grace's voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath now. Your mother, she is my patient. My job is to care for her, and caring for her means giving her what she needs, not what you want. I'm her son. You are her son who did not visit for 1 year. Grace stepped closer, and despite being smaller than him, despite her accent and her foreignness and her complete lack of power in the situation, she somehow seemed larger. You are her son who put cameras in her room so you do not have to look at her with your real eyes. You are her son who keep her sister away, who keep her friends away, who keep everyone away so she has nobody except strangers you pay. I pay you. Yes, you pay me. You think that is enough? You think money fix what you break? Grace's eyes were wet, but her voice stayed steady. In our country, we have a saying, a child who say his mother's food is bitter will one day cook for himself and know the truth. You do not know what your mother sacrificed for you. You do not know how many nights she worked late so you can eat. How many times she is tired but smile for you. How many dreams she bury so yours can grow. Daejung's throat was so tight he could barely breathe. She told you that? She does not have to tell me. I see it in her eyes when she look at your picture. Even now, after everything, she look at you with love, not anger, love. Grace wiped her eyes roughly. And you do not deserve it. The words hit him like a physical blow. But maybe, Grace continued, softer now, maybe you can become someone who does. Maybe it is not too late to be the son she need instead of the son you think you are. From the bedroom, his aunt's voice called out, Grace? Is someone there? Grace didn't break eye contact with Daejung. Your mother is in there. She is awake. She is speaking. She is asking for you. She is? No. Grace's honesty was brutal, but she should not have to ask. You should want to go to her. And then she stepped aside, leaving the path to the bedroom clear. The door was open just enough for Daejung to see inside, his aunt sitting beside the bed, his mother's hand in hers, the afternoon light coming through windows that Grace must have opened because the room smelled like fresh air instead of antiseptic. His mother's face was turned toward the door. She could see him standing there. Their eyes met, and Daejung saw everything in that moment. The stroke's damage, yes, but also the woman she'd been before, the mother who'd raised him alone, who'd worked her fingers to the bone, who'd believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. And he saw that she was still that woman. Broken, yes. Changed, yes. But still her. He could walk away now, get back in his car, return to his meetings and his money, and his carefully constructed life where guilt was something you managed with expense accounts and camera feeds. Or he could walk through that door, not as the man he'd become, the one his father would be ashamed of, the one his mother had told the truth about, but as the man he might still have a chance to be. If you could undo one moment in your life, one choice that set everything else wrong into motion, would you? Or would you be too afraid that you couldn't live with who you'd have to become to make it right? Daejung took a step forward, then another. His aunt saw him and her face hardened, but she didn't leave. She stayed right there, protecting his mother even from him, and he deserved that. Grace slipped past him and went to the other side of the bed, taking up her position as if to say, you can enter, but you're not pushing me out. And Mi-sun just watched him approach with eyes that held everything. Pain, disappointment, memory, but underneath it all, buried so deep he almost missed it, hope. The terrible, fragile hope that mothers carry for their children, even when those children break their hearts. He made it to the bedside and stood there, this powerful man who commanded rooms full of criminals and moved money across borders and had people killed with a phone call, and he had absolutely no idea what to say. So he said the only true thing he had left. "Amma," he whispered, "I'm sorry." Misun's hand moved, slowly, shakily, but deliberately, reaching toward him, not to comfort him, he didn't deserve comfort, but to touch him, to confirm he was real, to give him the same thing Grace had given her all these months, presence. Dae-jung took his mother's hand, and it was smaller than he remembered, more fragile, damaged by the stroke and the year of lying in bed and all the ways bodies betray us when we're not paying attention. But it was warm, and it was holding on. "I know," Misun said, the words thick and slow but unmistakable. "I know you are." Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever. Just acknowledgement that he'd finally shown up. Grace moved quietly to the door, giving them privacy, but before she left, she caught Dae-jung's eye. "This is the beginning, not the end. You understand? You cannot visit once and think you have fixed everything. She need you to stay, not watching through camera, here, real." Dae-jung nodded, not trusting his voice. His aunt squeezed Misun's other hand. "I will come back tomorrow, Ani, and the day after. Every day now. He cannot keep me away anymore." She looked at Dae-jung when she said it, and there was no question in her tone. She was informing him, not asking permission. He nodded again. After they left, Grace to give them time, his aunt to catch her bus back through Busan, it was just Dae-jung and Misun in the afternoon quiet. "The house," said Misun after a long silence. "Too big. I know. Too quiet. I know. I miss my shop." And there it was, the truth he'd been avoiding. His mother had never wanted this life he'd bought her. She wanted her small apartment above her salon, her friends from the neighborhood, her independence. He'd given her a prison and called it protection. He'd given her isolation and called it safety. He'd given her everything except what she actually needed: to be seen, to be heard, to be valued for who she was instead of managed like a problem to be solved. "I can't undo what I did," Dae-jung said. "I can't give you back the year you lost. I can't—" His voice cracked. "I can't even promise I'll be good at this, at being here. I don't know how." Misun's grip on his hand tightened slightly. "Learn," she said. One word, one command. Learn to be present. Learn to care. Learn to be the son she'd raised instead of the man he'd become. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something harder, an assignment, a challenge, proof that she still believed he could be better, even after everything. Do you know what it means when someone gives you another chance not because you deserve it, but because they refuse to give up on who you might become? Dae-jung stayed until Grace came back to help with dinner, and then he stayed through dinner, watching Grace feed his mother with practiced care, learning the rhythm of it, the patience required, the small celebrations when Misun managed to swallow without coughing. "You can help tomorrow," Grace said, "if you come back. I'll come back. Your mother, she likes soup in the evening, not too hot, and she like when I describe what is in it while she eat, the vegetables, the spices. It help her remember taste." Dae-jung nodded, taking mental notes like this was a business briefing, because that's the only way he knew how to process information that mattered. Before he left, he disconnected the cameras. All of them. Grace watched him do it without comment, just a small nod of approval. "You do not need to watch anymore," she said. "You can just be here." That night, alone in his downtown apartment, Daejong sat in the dark and thought about his father, the man he barely remembered, the construction worker who died building someone else's dream, who'd never lived to see his son become successful or his wife cared for in comfort. His mother said his father would be ashamed. She was right. But maybe, just maybe, if Daejong actually showed up, actually tried, actually learned to be present instead of just powerful, maybe there was still time to become someone his father wouldn't be ashamed of, someone his mother wouldn't have to make excuses for, someone worthy of Grace's quiet, devastating honesty. The cameras were gone, the walls were coming down, and for the first time in over a year, Daejong fell asleep not wondering what his mother was doing, but planning what he would say to her tomorrow when he showed up. Not watched, just there. What would you give up to become the person someone still believes you can be? Your pride? Your excuses? Your carefully constructed distance? Everything? 6 months later, Mi-sun could walk. Not far, not well, just from the bed to the chair by the window, her hand gripping Grace's arm on one side and a cane on the other, her steps slow and uncertain, her right leg dragging slightly behind. But she could walk. And on the days when Daejong visited, which was most days now, though he still sometimes canceled last minute with apologies Grace had learned to accept without comment, Mi-sun would wait until she heard his car in the driveway before making the journey from bed to chair, because she wanted him to see her sitting up when he arrived. Grace understood why, even if she'd never say it out loud. Some dignity you have to reclaim inch by inch, step by painful step. The house was different now in ways that had nothing to do with the missing cameras. There were photographs on the walls, real ones in frames Grace had bought from the market, showing Mi-sun young and laughing outside her salon, Mi-sun holding baby Daejong, Mi-sun with her sister at the beach decades ago when the world was simpler and smaller. The window stayed open most days, letting in street noise and cooking smells from neighboring houses and all the messy proof that life was happening outside these walls. Mi-sun's sister visited every Thursday and brought gossip from Busan, and sometimes friends from the old neighborhood who'd thought Mi-sun had disappeared, who cried when they saw her and held her hands, and talked about the old days until Mi-sun's voice would give out from laughing and trying to keep up. Grace had started teaching Mi-sun phrases in Igbo during their afternoon sessions, simple things like thank you and you are kind and I see you, and Mi-sun would practice them with the same determination she brought to physical therapy, her tongue struggling around unfamiliar sounds the way her legs struggled to remember how to hold her weight. "Why you want to learn my language?" Grace asked, amused and touched. Mi-sun looked at her for a long moment, her eyes sharp despite the droop on one side of her face. "You learned mine," she'd said simply. "Some debts can't be repaid, only honored." Daejong came on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring with grocery bags full of ingredients Grace had texted him that morning: gochugaru, doenjang, dried anchovies, the building blocks of Korean comfort food. He'd been learning to cook. Not from Grace, she'd made it clear this wasn't her job, but from YouTube videos he watched late at night in his apartment, from his aunt, who'd started calling him every Sunday with recipes and unsolicited advice, from the fumbling trial and error of someone trying to remember what home used to taste like. "You're early," Grace said when she opened the door. She had flour on her cheek and was wearing the yellow head wrap she always wore when she cooked, and the house smelled like something sweet baking. "Meeting ended early. I held up the bags. I thought maybe I could make dinner today, if you don't mind." Grace studied him for a moment. She still did that. Still looked at him like she was measuring whether he meant what he said or was just performing goodness. Then nodded and stepped aside. "Your mother is in the sunroom. She has been waiting." His mother was always waiting. That's what mothers did. The sunroom was different now, too. The jade plant was gone, it had finally died, and Grace had replaced it with succulents that actually thrived, bright green and stubborn and alive. Mi-sun sat in the good chair, the one position to catch the afternoon light, and she was holding a book in her lap, though Dae-jung suspected she'd been looking out the window more than reading. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and her face did that thing it always did now, a complicated expression that held too many emotions to name, love and hurt and hope and resignation all tangled together. Dae-jung, she said. His name came easier now, though her speech was still slurred enough that strangers sometimes struggled to understand her. Aylma. He set the grocery bags down and crossed the room, bent to kiss her forehead the way Grace had taught him to do, the small gesture of affection that had felt awkward at first, but now came naturally. Mi-sun's hand came up to touch his cheek, her movement still slow but deliberate. You look tired. I'm okay. You always say that. He smiled beside himself. I learned from the best. He both knew who he meant, the woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion for years while telling everyone she was fine, who'd hidden her loneliness behind smiles and small talk, who'd suffered in silence because that's what her generation of Korean women had been taught to do. Do you ever look at your mother and see all the ways you've inherited her, the patterns you swore you'd never repeat? I'm making kimchi jjigae tonight. Grace has been teaching me, well, not teaching, she refuses to teach me, but she leaves recipes out where I can see them, which is basically the same thing. Mi-sun's mouth twitched, the closest she could get to a full smile these days. She is stubborn. She reminds me of you. Good. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that used to terrify Dae-jung because it meant being present without distraction, without excuses, without anything to hide behind. But he'd been practicing this too, just sitting with his mother, being there, letting her presence be enough. Grace's visa, it expires soon, yes? Dae-jung had been avoiding thinking about this. Grace's work visa was good for another 8 months, and then, unless she found another sponsorship, another family, another reason to stay in Korea, she'd have to return to Nigeria. I've been looking into it carefully. There are options. I could sponsor her directly, hire her permanently instead of through the agency, if that's what she wants. Ask her. I did. She said she needs to think about it. Mi-sun nodded slowly, her eyes distant. She has family in her home, a mother who is sick. She'd tell me sometimes. Of course Grace had family. Of course she left people behind to come here, to take care of strangers, to do the work that needed doing because someone had to, and the pay was better than what she could make at home. Grace was doing for her own mother what Dae-jung had failed to do for his. The irony wasn't lost on him. If she leaves, he started. Then she leaves. Mi-sun's voice was firm despite the slur. We do not trap her, you understand? We do not make her feel she cannot go. That is what you did to me. The words landed softly, but precisely, a scalpel instead of a hammer. Dae-jung nodded, his throat tight. But we can hope she stays, Mi-sun added, quieter now. We can show her she is valued, wanted, not just needed. Do you know the difference between being needed and being wanted? Between someone staying because they have to and someone staying because they choose to? That evening, Dae-jung made dinner while Grace supervised with amused patience, correcting his knife work and his timing, and the way he stirred the pot too aggressively, like he was angry at the stew. Gentle, she kept saying. Cooking is not fighting. Gentle. Mi-sun sat at the kitchen table in her wheelchair, she couldn't stand long enough to eat at the counter, and watched them move around each other, this odd family they'd accidentally become. Her son learning to cook, her caregiver teaching him, both of them trying, in their own ways, to give her something that looked like normalcy. When they finally sat down to eat, the stew was too salty and the rice was slightly undercooked, but no one mentioned it. Grace said a prayer in Igbo, the way she always did, and Mi-sun murmured along phonetically with the words she'd learned, and Dae-jung sat with his hands folded and his eyes closed, still not entirely sure what he was praying for, but grateful to be included in the ritual. After dinner, Grace helped Mi-sun to bed while Dae-jung washed dishes, another skill he'd had to learn from YouTube, another small act of service that would have been beneath him a year ago. When Grace came back to the kitchen, she leaned against the doorframe and watched him for a moment. "You are getting better at this," she said. "At washing dishes? At being here." He dried his hands and turned to face her. "Grace, about your visa, I know what you will ask, and I do not have answer yet. That's okay. I just want you to know that whatever you decide, we'll make it work. If you need to go home, if your mother needs you, we'll find someone good to take over, and if you want to stay, you will pay me more." There was a hint of teasing in her voice, but also genuine curiosity. "Yes, and I'll sponsor your visa, and—" He paused, trying to find words for something he'd never been good at expressing. "And we would miss you. Not just because you're good at your job, because you're family now, somehow." Grace's eyes went soft. "You say this now. 6 months ago, you would have been happy if I disappear. 6 months ago, I was an idiot. And now? Now I'm an idiot who's trying not to be." She laughed, the sound bright and real, and it reminded him why his mother smiled more these days, why the house felt different, why any of this healing had been possible at all. Grace had walked into their broken family and simply refused to let them stay broken. "I will think about it," Grace said finally. "I will pray on it, and I will tell you when I know. That's all I ask." After she left for the evening, Grace had her own small apartment across the city, though she spent most of her waking hours here. Dae-jung went back to check on his mother one final time. Mi-sun was awake, staring at the ceiling. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. "Thinking." He pulled the chair closer to her bed and sat down. "About what?" "About before. About after." Her hand found his in the darkness. "About how strange life is. How one person can change everything. Grace." "Yes, but also you." Dae-jung didn't know what to say to that. "You are not the same. Still learning. Still making mistakes. But trying. That is enough for now." For now. Not forever. Not absolution. Just enough for today. And maybe tomorrow. And maybe the day after that. "I love you, Emma," I said into the darkness. Mi-sun's hand squeezed his, stronger now than it had been months ago, but still fragile, still marked by everything she'd survived. "I know," she whispered. "I always knew. Even when he'd hurt her, even when he'd disappeared, even when he'd chosen everything else over her. She'd known. Because that's what mothers do. They know. They remember who you were before you forgot. They hold on to hope long past the point where logic says to let go. They wait." Outside, Seoul hummed with its endless noise and motion. Inside, a son held his mother's hand and waited for morning. And somewhere between them, in the choice to stay, in the work of showing up, in the slow transformation of guilt into something that might eventually become grace, was the beginning of something that looked almost like forgiveness. Almost. When was the last time you just sat with someone you love and didn't need anything from them? When was the last time you showed up not because it was easy, but because it mattered? Some questions don't have answers. They just have tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. Are you still waiting for what happens tomorrow? We'll find out in the next story. Thank you for watching. We love you.